Unit 1, Stormwater 101, Lesson 2, Urban Runoff Pollution. In the first lesson, we talked about the impacts of disrupting the water balance, how the great increase in runoff in urban environments has impacts for aquatic habitats, groundwater aquifers, and flooding. In this lesson, we'll cover the other major impact of urban runoff, pollution. We're talking about rain, which generally seems pretty clean, so why is this even an issue? Well, rain starts out clean, but in flowing over urban areas, it picks up all sorts of contamination. This pollution comes from a number of different sources. There's litter, especially those that break down into small pieces and are washed down into storm drains like cigarette butts and styrofoam. There's pet and animal waste on lawns and sidewalks. Vehicles which discharge oil, grease, and other harmful fluids, as well as heavy metals. Some types of synthetic tires also leave behind microplastics. This is actually one of the major sources of microplastic pollution, according to a European study. Pesticides and fertilizers are washed off from residential and commercial lawns and gardens. Road salt and sand comes off of roads and sidewalks with rain and snowmelt. Sediment from construction sites or undeveloped, unvegetated lands is washed off. And then there are the chemical spills, both residential and industrial, that flow into waterways. There's also the added issue of sewage pollution, which we'll talk more about in the next lesson. For now, we're just talking about the pollution that comes from runoff. The actual quality of a given sample of stormwater will vary a lot depending on where it comes from, but it's pretty consistent that it will exceed guidelines for drinking, swimming, and recreation, and carry contaminants like oil and grease, lead, zinc, fecal coliform forming bacteria, microplastics, nitrogen, and phosphorus. This type of pollution is known as non-point source pollution because it's coming from all over and you can't point a finger at a single big polluter in order to clean it up, unlike, say, a wastewater treatment plant. But non-point source pollution is usually one of the biggest sources of pollution to water bodies in urban areas. Most of this pollution doesn't receive any treatment before it enters water bodies. And in many places, it's not really being addressed at all. Some of the impacts that this pollution has on our communities and ecosystems are beaches, which are frequently closed due to elevated levels of bacteria in the water, sometimes due to sewage pollution, but often also due to urban runoff pollution. Large amounts of sediment affecting visibility and making recreation less appealing, even if it's not technically dangerous, as well as impacting aquatic habitats. The fish also consume the chemicals, heavy metals, and microplastics from urban runoff, and this travels up the food chain when we consume these fish. Nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers contribute to the growth of algae blooms, some of which are toxic and can impact drinking water, and others which are not toxic but still impact recreation and destroy fish and fish habitats. In areas where road salt is heavily used, some urban streams or bodies of water have salt levels that are higher than the ocean. Finally, there's also the issue of thermal pollution. The runoff from urban areas warms up cold water streams, changing the temperature enough so that fish that rely on cold temperatures can no longer survive in these urban streams. There is a direct and well-studied connection between the amount of impervious surface in a watershed and water body health. Above about 10% imperviousness, the health begins to deteriorate significantly. You probably don't need to look very far to see some of the impacts in your community. Check out your urban beaches on the Swim Guide website. How often are they closed in the summer? Do you see algae blooms in your local water bodies? Is road salt used to excess in your community? Are fish populations healthy? Check out some of the additional resources on this topic, and in the next lesson we'll go over the stormwater management practices that have been commonly used over the last several decades in Canada, and how these systems are a part of the problem as well as the solution.